Good morning, everyone. I'm Suad El Ashkar, and I am a math coach with HRCE. I do support English programs as well as second language, French as a second language programs, teachers, and students in the classroom.
My name's Deidre Peveril, and I am a grade 7 and 8 French immersion math teacher.
Welcome to our session today.
We'd like to start by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The treaties of peace and friendship cover this territory.
All right, and before we start, we would like to share with you a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. Please make sure you use the session chat if you have any questions or comments. A link to this presentation will be shared with you later. And if you have not introduced yourself and you feel like you'd like to, please introduce yourself in the chat. Name, role, region, grade level you teach, and what or support, and what's your experience with building thinking classrooms. Maybe I'll just wait a second here. Let me know, Deidre, if... All right. So our agenda for today is to talk about why we chose to implement building thinking classrooms in our classrooms. Pierre Liljedahl is a professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. He wrote Building Thinking Classrooms to share 15 years worth of research he conducted with more than 400 teachers. We had the privilege of spending a full day learning with him and from him at HRCE last fall. And we've also attended some of his presentations and webinars. His research aims to get students to do more of the thinking in a math classroom. And in his book, he describes 14 practices and decisions that create conditions for students to think. Today, we are here to share with you why we decided we want to try some of those practices, to tell you how we did it and what we learned, to share with you some resources we've used. And we also would love to hear from you if you've tried any of those, or if you have any questions. We want you to know that this was our first year gradually implementing building thinking classroom practices in our classrooms. We certainly are no experts, nor do we know it all, but we were willing to try something different to foster student thinking. We are happy you are joining us today, and if you are implementing building thinking classroom practices for the first time, or you have not done so yet, please keep in mind that this session is intended for teachers who have already implemented practices from the first toolkits. We will go over those briefly, but we encourage you to start there and read the book. And if you're starting new, start there. We'll talk about our why next. The Building Thinking Classroom framework, we believe, provides an opportunity for students to experience some aspects of the nature of math as a discipline beyond the traditional views of what math is and how students are expected to behave in math class. In fact, in a building thinking classroom, students are not following the typical I do, we do, you do approach of learning. They are not mimicking, but they are more actively engaged in their learning with no place to hide. They work together, think, get stuck, look around for clues and hints, get ideas, test these ideas, and when these work, they are very proud of what they have accomplished and move on to the next task. We find that the Building Thinking Classroom framework provides an opportunity to build a classroom math community with students at its center. By working in groups and relying on each other, the transfer of knowledge happening among students is very visible. The teachers are only facilitators. We also think that the Building Thinking Classroom framework provides students with different opportunities to demonstrate their learning in different ways and to develop their self-assessment skills. These are part of the directives of the Nova Scotia Assessment Policy. Last but not least, many of the building thinking classroom practices lend themselves to creating a more inclusive and culturally responsive environment. In a building thinking classroom, students with various abilities work in random groups on vertical non-permanent surfaces One of the observations this past year was that this collaborative and collective learning piece is beginning to play a very positive role at the junior high level. Students are more willing to share their thinking when the thinking is group thinking and versus individual.
Suad, I'm not sure what's going on your end there, but I can't see your screen share. Oh, it's back.
No? Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it now. Perfect.
Right.
So we've broken this presentation up into some of the different practices as described in the book. So the first one is presenting a thinking task to your students. So it is a shift in how you do things in the classroom. So coming into this with a positive mindset is important. Try building thinking classrooms because you want to. Implement some practices, embrace gradual change, show enthusiasm, tell students that you're all about to try something new. And they really need to perceive this change as an opportunity to collaborate and work together. And this is why a positive and collaborative learning environment is essential. They might resist some changes, but it will get better. Use your discretion. There's no prescribed recipe that works for every classroom and every teacher. And depending on your students, you might want to discuss what it means to work in collaborative groups and then co-construct success criteria with them. And you could post those norms in your classroom if you would like to. And you might want to discuss why learning how to work with different people is an important life skill. So if you want to move to the next slide. Yeah. So before presenting your thinking task, you're going to want to put your students in groups. And groups of three have turned out to be the ideal number of students to have in a group. If you don't have a multiple of 3 for the number of students in your classroom, which would be an ideal world, but we don't live in that, groups of 2 are preferred over groups of 4. They should be visibly random. They need to think that we're not rigging the groups. Personally, I like to put all of their names on popsicle sticks and randomly select groups of 3. That way, there's less of a chance of them switching groups because I know who's in which group. But handing out playing cards or using a virtual random group generator works too. There might be some pushback on random groups, especially at the beginning, because it can be uncomfortable for some students. Having conversations with them about why random groups is important can be helpful. A lot of my students really grumbled about the random groups, but at the end of the year, I did ask them for some anonymous feedback on how the year went. And one of my students said, I liked how math class helped me branch out more. Some of my best friends now are people that I wouldn't have even thought about talking to when school started. Now I talk to them for hours at a time. So they may have grumbled, but some of them saw some use in it too. So last year, every day when my students came in, I gave them random groups, and that ended up being their seating plan for the day. That didn't always work out great, and it kind of made it difficult for substitute teachers and support staff coming in and trying to learn their names or knowing who was who. So this year I'm planning on having more of a home-based seating plan for them and then breaking them into groups when it's time to work at the whiteboards. So next is what? So what are they working on? So there's 2 types of tasks. They're called curricular and non-curricular tasks. The first few days, I'll really spend focusing on non-curricular tasks so that they get used to this style of engaging with math. We'll also do some debriefing on norms for our classroom during that day so that hopefully we're set up for more success when it comes to curricular tasks. It is a good idea to try or solve the tasks first, especially if it's a new one for you so that you know where they're going. And it can be overwhelming and time-consuming to look for resources, but you really don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots available in the Building Thinking Classrooms book. And in your textbook, you can take some of those explore activities and kind of change them a little bit to present them as a thinking task. And social media has a lot. There's a great Facebook group. Twitter or X now has a lot of things that you can get for thinking tasks. You just need to make sure that they align with our Nova Scotia outcomes, and you might have to adjust them. So again, use the available resources. You don't need to spend hours recreating things that you already have. Instead, think of how you can deliver those tasks differently. So a suggestion is to choose tasks that allow for extensions or think of ways that you can extend the task at hand. It might be an open question, higher level thinking. So things like the Open Middle website have some really great activities that can be presented as thinking tasks. And you're really looking for some low floor, high ceiling problem solving tasks or thin sliced sequences. So it's important that there's never an end and that they're never done. And when presenting the task, it's helpful for the teacher to have a different color marker that the students aren't allowed to use. So in my classroom, my kids know that the teacher uses the red marker and they can't use a red colored marker, so that when they look around the room, they know what the teacher's written on the boards quickly. So where and when do you present a thinking task? So you want to present your task in the first 5 minutes of class because that's when you have the most attention. And where? Well, you want to mix it up. We're trying to defront our classroom. So you might pull them into one area of the room one day and another area another day. They gather around. Some of them are sitting, some of them are standing around. And I try not to use the same location 2 days in a row. So how? So you're going to run into some problems. Some possible norms that I like to use when they're working at the vertical non-permanent surfaces, or VNPS, is that they only get one marker per group, so that they're actually collaborating and communicating with one another. If they have several markers, they don't always end up talking. If you end up with one person that's taking over and doing all of the work while the other two just look at what's going on, you can give them a rule that the person with the marker can only write down what other people say. And they're standing at vertical non-permanent surfaces. I'm sorry, my dog's barking behind it. Apologies. When it comes to setting up your vertical non-permanent surfaces, you really don't need to have, the prettiest Pinterest setup. You can use the whiteboards that are already in your room and divide them into sections. You can hang smaller whiteboards with command strips. You can use the windows. You can use the side of a filing cabinet. You can use white books. There's a lot of different things that you can use for your vertical non-permanent surfaces. So on the next slide, we've got a couple pictures of some different setups. Once it comes up, there we go. So here you can see students gathered around. And in the second picture, I've actually taken them outside and we've used the windows on the outside of our cafeteria. So they really liked the change in scenery. I'd suggest having like a fanny pack for markers, and then you can toss them all in and head on out. And we've also linked some different places to get tasks here. So there's non-curricular tasks in English and French, as well as a link to the Alicia Burdess book. So her book aligns with the grade 8 Alberta curriculum, and there's some really good curricular and non-curricular tasks there. And on the next slide, we have 2 examples. The first is a non-curricular task, and then the second is a curricular task that aligns with the grade 9 curriculum here in Nova Scotia. It's an open question where students have to come up with other possible points on a line if they're given 1 point. So the open question is really good because it allows for entry for all students. They can all come up with something, but you're going to get a bunch of different complexities in what they come up with. So it allows for rich conversations, and it changes students' perception of what math is. They're not just looking for one right answer. There could be multiple right answers.
All right. Next, we will be speaking about how to manage flow. Our students come to the math classroom with different abilities and skills. When working on curricular thinking tasks, it is important to keep a balance between the level of challenge of the task and the student's ability. This balance is crucial, as if the challenge is too high, students will get frustrated, and if it's too easy, then they will be bored. Peter Laridal illustrates this idea through the graphic that you can see here. To keep the balance between challenge and ability, we need to keep the students in flow. Keeping them in flow means keeping them engaged and thinking. We will discuss how next we manage the flow through thin slicing tasks, hints and extensions, and knowledge mobility and collaboration. Thin slicing tasks refer to the sequence of small tasks where the increase in challenge from one task to the next is small and gradual, just to avoid frustration. When planning our task, we made sure to start our sequence with a task that requires either accessing existing knowledge or things that students know already before. Next, we changed our aspect of the task to reflect a gradual increase in the level of difficulty. The drawback we faced really was that because we have so many students and they have different abilities in the classroom, some groups were moving through the task very quickly and others were not. So we found that it's better to be over prepared and have extensions for those who are done than to just have enough for everyone. There were times when we noticed that the members of a group were off task and they either did not know where to start or they had tried something and did not work. Our initial reaction was to direct them to a different group and let them work together. But sometimes we also grouped two groups together and asked them to figure out what's going on. Um, this worked for most of the time, but there were times when the imbalance between the challenge and students' ability required us to give them hints. And those hints varied from explicitly reminding students of certain strategies or redirecting them to their notes or even to giving them a partial solution or even the first step. Um, Sometimes we asked them prompting questions and that helped as well. But there were times where also the imbalance was huge among many groups. And so we decided to stop for a bit, have a mini intervention, bring the whole class together, and prompt their thinking. Depending on the number of students and groups you have, this may sound and look overwhelming. So here are a few tips that we found helpful to manage the flow. Developing knowledge mobility is extremely important in order to manage flow. Set rules. Set a rule actually that whenever students are working on a task, they have to write it at the very top of their whiteboard or vertical non-permanent surface. This is called the banner method. This keeps it easy for others to see what's the next task and they can steal it when they're done. This frees you up and lets you go and attend to other groups and their needs and whatever intervention you need to give them, whether it's hints or extensions. Try not to answer stop thinking questions. Sometimes they would come and say, hey, is this right? Well, don't answer that. Ask them. Instead, answer that with a question. Like ask them, what do you think? What do your friends think? What do your group members think? Look at other groups. Ask them. Redirect their thinking. Do not answer stop thinking questions. We also found that developing culture where every group member has to be able to explain each task before moving on to the next one was important. That would slow them a little bit down instead of like, here we go, I'm done. Everyone needs to understand what and how things work. Remember to balance challenge and ability by slowly increasing the challenge. I'll leave you with this thought from one of Deidre's students. The whiteboard help with confidence because if you don't understand something, you can get help from a partner or give help and seem like a team member. Now, here is an example. We wanted to include a simple example of how we used thin slicing without reinventing the wheel. This is an example that we used from the grade 8 students textbook, and we used that with grade 8 students last fall. It is an adaptation of a task on page 6 in Math Makes Sense 8. I'm not going to go into the details of what the task is. You can read it once you have the link of this presentation. But we wanted to know that we presented the task verbally and added more numbers as the teams were able to explain their reasoning. We took some time planning, and we had to think about the sequence of numbers we wanted to use. Our message here today for you is start small and use resources you already have. I have to admit that planning was sometimes very messy, as you can see on that picture on the right-hand side of the board. It is not always easy to reimagine our practice through the lens of structured or guided inquiry at all. Here's another example of thin slicing that we used. And this one involves an outcome that requires demonstrate understanding through different representation. As you can see on the left, it may not be too clear, but we started by introducing solving equations pictorially. Our first task was to ask students to write a math sentence that described the balance between just two equal weight. We didn't introduce any variables first, and then we gradually introduced zero pair. Then we introduced one variable at one side, and then distributive property, all through the models first. And then on the right-hand side, we prepared a series of equations to solve symbolically that would gradually increase in difficulty. In both cases, we were overplanned and we made sure to include extensions. The extension of the first task included students asking students to create their own balance and then give it to the next group, let them figure out what the equation is and what the value of the variable was. You can always find also at some of your schools, you can find this book. It's in the balance, grades 7 to 9. And if you don't have that, it has great visual balances of like it's very similar to Solve Me Mobile, and we have a link here, puzzles, where the students have to figure out what's the weight of each shape, keeping the balance. That's there. And on the right-hand side, we used Open Middle as an extension, where students had to use numbers from 1 to 9 to only once to create the greatest value of X in this case.
So the next step after you're managing flow is consolidation. In a traditional classroom, the teacher typically shows the students how to work through a particular task before working towards more independence with the task. So the typical I do, we do, you do approach. So you might have a mini lesson with note taking followed by practice questions and homework. But in a thinking classroom, the mini lesson comes after the group work in the form of consolidation. So you're still highlighting the important concepts or skills that you would in a traditional framework. The difference is that you're using student work to bring those things to light. It's something that takes a lot of planning, a lot of practice. It's one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on this year to try to finesse a little bit more. Some days you're going to feel like you really nailed the consolidation and it went really well. And other days you might think, I'm not sure that we hit everything that we needed to hit today. It's okay to go back the next day and revisit those ideas that you weren't sure that you got right during the consolidation. So preparing for consolidation. So you want to go into your thinking task with an idea of what you're looking for. And preparing for consolidation starts as soon as students begin working on that task. So you think about what you'd likely present in a traditional lesson and look for those things in student work. And you're going to want to start from the bottom. So you're going to want to have simpler things followed by more challenging problems. So as students are working, you want to box in things that you might want to visit during consolidation with a uniquely colored marker. So like I said, I like to use red, and they learn that they're not allowed to erase anything that's inside that red box or circle or whatever you use. So when you see something you like, you go over with your marker, box it in. If they've used the whole board, you can always ask them to write it smaller in the corner. If you're looking for something specific that you want to see, you might want to plant those seeds with a few different groups during the task so that hopefully that comes out in at least one group, and then you can box that in as well. When you notice that too many groups are getting close to the end or that flow is waning, you're going to want to take a look at what you've boxed in throughout the class and create a plan of what order you're going to revisit for your consolidation. So at first, when you're starting to number your boards for your order, they're going to think that that's their grade. So when you put a 1 on their board or a 2 on the board, you might see a couple panicked looks. Explain to them that, no, you didn't get a 2 on your work. It's okay. That's just, we're going to visit your board after, and I want to know what order I'm going in so that I'm not looking around confused. And then once they realize that, they start to get a little excited when you start numbering their boards. They're like, oh, we're going to talk about our board today. So like I said, when highlighting their work, start from the bottom, work your way up to more complicated problems. It's okay if you don't end up visiting all of the things that you boxed in during the lesson. And it's nice to try to crisscross the room during your consolidation for your gallery walk. So now that you have your plan, it's time to actually do the consolidation. So I like to pull students to the center of the room away from their boards so that they have more anonymity when we're going and visiting the boards, so that they don't know exactly whose board we're visiting necessarily. When I bring them to the center, we talk about, well, what was the task for today? We do a quick 30-second recap, and then we'll start going with the guided gallery walk from board to board. So when you visit the student work, have them look at the board, and then a really nice little micro move, as Peter Liljedahl likes to call it, is to have somebody that wasn't in the group explain what that group was thinking. You might have some crickets at first. It does get better You just might have to work through some awkward silences until that they're used to that style, because they're going to have to look at the board, understand it, and then work up that courage the first few times to talk about somebody else's work. And it's during consolidation that it's really your mini lesson that I like to highlight vocabulary, and I might write it on a corresponding board so that when they go back and sit down and they're doing their notes, they can look around. And you might want to add a couple examples if you're talking about certain things as well. So on the next slide, we have a couple pictures of students visiting boards. So like I said, you can have them bring them to a board and say, can someone who's not in this group explain what this group is thinking? And it really leads to more engagement. And in the middle there, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's just an example of a teacher creating a plan for sequencing the consolidation. So like I said, it does take a lot of planning as you're moving through the lesson, helping students, giving hints, pointing them in the right direction, giving them the next task. Consolidation is always in the back of your mind. Okay, what do I need to get out of this? So it's really important to know what you're looking for before you start.
All right, next we will be speaking about meaningful notes. Well, in classrooms where students are expected to take notes, they typically copy word for word what the teacher writes on the board. I have also been in classrooms where students use fill-in-the-blank style notes, where they have to fill missing pieces as the teacher explains or writes on the board. The main problem here is that in both cases, the teacher is the one doing the thinking and not the students. In a thinking classroom, we want students to think and create their own notes in a meaningful way. And so why and when and how? So the why is, well, because meaningful notes provide students with their first really individual opportunity of consolidating what they have learned as a group. So far they have been on vertical non-permanent surfaces. They have worked with groups. We've done consolidation as a whole class. Now, writing the notes is their first encounter of actually doing something individually for them. In a thinking classroom, students create their own notes instead of copying teacher-provided notes. That is, students take ownership over their own notes. Therefore, it is important to spend some time and discuss that with them. They need to know that these notes are by them and for them, and they're not for us teachers. Students should be encouraged also to take notes about important things and write them down in a way that makes sense to them when they look back at them, not in the so near future, not tomorrow. It's I'm coming back to them in a month and see what do I understand what I wrote? And that's why Peter Lillard refers to them as notes to my future forgetful self. By doing so, not only do we build sense of independence, but we also have a window of what do students value when they write notes. And so the when, and so when do we write those notes? Typically and ideally, you would want to do that right after the consolidation for about 10 or 15 minutes. Students should work toward doing so independently, and they can always add to those notes anytime during instruction or later on when they do a different task. Now, give me a second here. The how we did it, it really varied from classroom to classroom and from students to students. Ideally and theoretically, we would want them to create their own notes from scratch with no guidance. But that is not really something that we experienced junior high students were able to do on their own. So we felt the need to provide students with templates or graphic organizers as they were not ready yet to write their own notes from scratch. We used backward design to create outcome-based templates and made sure to include sections that reflect the indicators of the outcome in question. So depending on the outcome and its indicators, section varied from mathematical terminology, connections between different representation, models, exemplars. We had some error analysis questions, but we also left some white space for students to write down things that they don't want to forget, or mistakes that they want to avoid in the future, or anything else that they felt important to include. As again, these are notes by them for them. It was clear that this is a lot. There was actually a lot of buy-in in note taking. This is one of the practices where students often got back to us, as you can see here, and said, well, can we use our notes? Can we use our notes? Madam, can we use our note à mon futur moi? So this is something that students really bought in and were engaged in doing. Here is a template that we used for early on last fall. One of the recommendations in the book was not to check students' notes for correctness. And I have to admit that this is really hard to let go. And so here's an example of a template that we use. But as you can see on the right-hand side, we also had created an anchor chart in the classroom. And as students were writing their notes, that anchor chart was a mirror of the template. So as students were writing their notes, we were going around the room and just checking, observing, really not saying anything to the students. But at some points, we liked if we liked what they were saying in a section or what they wrote in a section, we would invite those students to go up and fill that out. And so we continued to do so up until the whole chart was filled. Now we had a chart filled by students and using their own notes, and it served for two purposes. One, it provides an access point for those students who had no idea what to write. It was really accessible, and they were insecure about their notes and what should I include. This is the first time we're ever doing this, so it was really a good access point for those students. But it also, on the other hand, it also was an anchor chart that stayed in the classroom for future references. Now, to tackle this insecurity of not knowing what else we can do, another way to do that, or not knowing what to write in our notes, another way to do that is to have students work in random groups and to create those meaningful notes. Let them go on the whiteboard, write a topic on top at the very top, and let them brainstorm about that topic as a team. And after brainstorming, students can go back and write what they'd like to include in their own notes. Now, I have seen this done that way, but I also have seen this after this brainstorming, it was the teacher and the students were co-constructing the notes together based on what the students wrote. In this instance, we used index cards. We didn't really use templates. And this seems like this aspect of motion and flipping really presented a new aspect that the kids really, really loved and bought in.
So after they've done their meaningful notes, it's time for what Peter Liljedahl calls check your understanding questions. But this isn't something new. It's what we would have always called homework or practice. But the change in how it's phrased, it's important because students perceive homework as something that they do for their teachers, not something that they do for themselves. Check your understanding questions are things that they do for themselves in order to move from group understanding to individual understanding. There's two important characteristics of check your understanding question. And the first is giving choice to students. So they get to choose how many questions and which questions they complete. And this gives them ownership of their learning. I find that this has been a hurdle for teachers, students, and for their parents because they want to know how many they need to do to be done. Parents want to know how many questions their child has to complete for homework, or I get a lot of questions from parents about the lack of homework. So this past year, I had a lot of conversations with both parents and students on how the number of questions that a student completes really depends on where they are in their learning and their understanding of the outcome. So some students might only have to complete a few questions and really understand it, and others might need to complete the majority of them to further their understanding. The Building Thinking Classrooms framework really emphasizes not assigning homework and that teachers aren't checking homework for completion of a certain number of problems, because students should be engaging with the work at a level that's appropriate for their own learning. But this sort of independence can really be a challenge for junior high students. So starting those conversations early with both them and their parents is important. The second characteristic of check your understanding questions is that they're leveled. So students choose what difficulty they feel comfortable with on any given day. Peter Liljedahl suggests mild, medium, and spicy for your categories. And I found that this works really well. They seem to enjoy that. And when they're going through like a thin slicing sequence, I get questions like, Madam, am I doing a spicy question yet? Are these the spicy ones? And they're so proud when they can complete those spicy math questions. So it's It's also important to have a conversation with students and parents about choosing an appropriate level of difficulty, because one thing that we've found was that you're going to have students that are going to stay in the mild or medium questions and never move on to those spicy questions. Or I had one student in particular who only wanted to do the spicy question, but they still needed to do some of the other questions to make sure that they had that base understanding of application and knowledge. So they need to know that they're going to be expected to show their understanding of a variety of different types of problems. And if they only ever tackle one type, they're going to have difficulty when it comes to assessment time. So on our next slide, we've got some examples here. There's no need to reinvent what you're doing. Right? You don't need to say, oh, I need to change all of the activities that I use for homework or practice. So the bottom left-hand corner is an example of how I quickly took the textbook one day and leveled it for students. So there were mild, medium, and spicy questions. They got to choose which ones they did. On the top right, we've leveled it again, but with the indicator. And check your understanding questions don't need to be simply textbook questions. You can use anything else that you've been using. I really like to use self-checking activities in my classroom because I do teach a combined 7-8 class. And when they have self-checking activities, they get immediate feedback on how they're doing. And then I spend less time answering questions like, is this right? So I find this really important in my combined class. And you can still take that self-checking activity and level it for them so that they know which parts are easy, which ones are medium, which ones are spicy. A quick little side note, I've found the BTC framework really, really useful in my combined class because it's made it possible to teach two things at once where that wasn't possible before. So it takes a little planning so that you're not starting and ending at exactly the same time, but it's possible to have two different thin sliced lessons going at once. And it's made my life easier in that way.
All right. So now that we spoke about presenting the thinking task, how to manage the flow, how we consolidated, and how we wrote meaningful notes, and how we checked our understanding, it's time to put it all together and then get the students to know where they are. There are so many, when you read the book, you stop and think on almost every step or every page, but there's that saying in the book that really caught my attention, and I read and reread it. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll go from there. For someone to be able to navigate by land or by sea, they need two pieces of information: where they are and where they are going. Both pieces of information are vital and equal value. If they don't know where they are, if they don't know where they're going, they are destined to get lost. And if they don't know where they are, well, they are already lost. I'm going to read this again. If they don't know where they are going, they are destined to get lost. And if they don't know where they are, well, they are already lost. That is, to me, the same thing for students. To foster autonomy and independence, we need to try to let students navigate their own learning. And to do so, they need to know where they are, as in what do they understand and what they can do, and where they are heading, and that is, what do I still need to know, learn, and do. And we use this as formative assessment in our classroom already, but sometimes we don't communicate it to students. It's formative assessment sometimes for us to talk about look at our practice. Communicating that to students is important. And so it is recommended by the Building Thinking Classroom framework to let students know where they are. So when I started working with Deidre this past spring, her students were learning about solving equations. And we thought about creating a navigation tool for those students to let them know what are the expectations and at what level. So we used outcome indicators, as you can see here on the left-hand side of this tool. These are outcome indicators. And we started by identifying textbook questions that would reflect each indicator at three levels: mild, medium, and spicy. We decided not to limit ourselves to questions in the textbook. So you can see here, sometimes we have other options for them from assignments that we used to use before. Some of them are self-checking, some are not. The students had enough options to choose what they'd like to do and complete in each category. And some indicators did not have complexity level. So look at the first one here. It doesn't have any spicy level questions. So we grade that out. And if we found that an indicator or an outcome had a subtopic was in many different places, we included that in many different places. Sorry, if you find a question that requires students that would meet many indicators, we included that question in different places in that table. Linking specific outcomes and specific indicators to questions helped students understand what the indicator really meant. And students were asked to use this tool as they were checking their understanding and reviewing for their unit test. They were encouraged to work independently, but they were always invited to ask for help or check with their friends if they need anything at all. As you can see under each indicator right here, we had left space for our students to self-assess once they were done with completing those tasks.
Wait, Suad,
Yeah.
we lost the screen.
Oh, all right. Let me see.
You're blinking in and out a little bit. It popped up for a second there and then popped back off.
Are we good now?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Give me a second. Let me try this. Okay, I'm gonna maybe stop sharing and share again, see if that works. How about now? Can you see it?
We got you.
Perfect. So do you think I should repeat or we're good?
Oh, you're gone again.
Am I gone again?
Yeah, it just has the SE. Yeah.
Oh, what about now?
Nope.
All right, let me try this. What if I remove my camera? What will happen? Can you see it now?
No. Yes, there it is.
All right. Now we're good?
We're good.
All right. So let's do this then. So should I keep going or do you think I should go back and talk about it?
I think we're good. You were talking about the indicators and their self-assessments.
Okay, so briefly, these are on the left-hand side here, we have indicators, and we have on the right-hand side questions from the textbooks that would reflect those indicators at different levels, mild, medium, spicy. Look at this indicator here. It didn't include, we couldn't find any questions at the spicy level, so we grade that out. And if we found that a question would tackle many indicator, we just included in the table in many different spots. Students were working independently, but they were always asked to check with peers if they need. That's fine. We didn't stress on that. So one thing that we really included as well was under each indicator, we left some space for students to self-assess through, we included just emojis here, and when they were done with those exercises, they were asked to self-assess. This was our adaptation of what was recommended really in the book, because this is the first time we were trying this with students. Peter Loriodal mentions that other ways of using this tool and instrument for self-assessment, like he would want the students maybe to indicate whether they completed this on their own or with a group, or did they do any silly mistakes. But we thought that this was too much at the first time we were introducing and this whole tool for the students, so we decided to adapt it in. So, and then we used this information from their self-assessment of how the students felt and what questions they attempted. We used that to support students where they identified they needed help. through targeted activities for the next couple of days before the unit test. I just want to mention that we tried this towards the end of the unit, but because it just happened that I was working with Deidre, and then we decided to try this. Her students were ready to start something new, and I also believe Deidre was ready to tackle the assessment piece. I would not recommend this. I would not recommend to start here if your students have not yet done other practices. And as I mentioned, we tried this towards the end of the unit, but if you use backward design to plan your lessons, you can always get this ready at the very beginning of the unit, hand it out to the students and let them self-assess along the way. It doesn't have to be at all at the end of the unit. And actually, this is Peter's recommendation, not just at the very end, but all along. Another thing that we found, and that is an adaptation that we actually included, is we felt that we want our students to be reminded of a couple of behaviors that we value. So we wanted to foster autonomy and independence, but we included questions that would aim at looking at their behavior in a building thinking classroom. So if you look here, we have questions for them that would ask them to self-reflect about whether they were participating in the group today or over the last few days, whether they attempted all levels of questions, whether they asked or engaged, asked questions to us, to their members, to their group members, and all of that. So we asked them to take the time and indicate a level of 1 to 3 where they were in their engagement. And I believe students were really honest in their responses. I think Deidre will have a better perspective on that. If you want to share, Deidre, what your students have said.
Yeah, once they realized they weren't being graded on that, they were very honest, and I could hear them having conversations throughout the class. It was like, oh, I was a little bit distracted today. I don't think I get a 3 on that one. Or, oh, do I need to go to extra help? Do I need to do this? And they were thinking about their behavior in the classroom when it comes to collaboration a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. It's not easy to shift from a typical traditional approach of teaching to one where they are independent and they have to make decisions. And it was important for us to provide opportunity for self-assessment. Maybe not just do it at the end. This is something that you may want to do again throughout your lessons, but it is something that may not be described per se in the textbook or in the book, in the Building Thinking Classroom book, but we decided to try with our students because we wanted them to be redirected. Right.
So after we did that self-checking activity, we developed this formative assessment tool. So formative assessment, or the gathering of information for the purposes of informing teaching and learning. And there are a lot of opportunities in a thinking classroom to have conversations with students and observe them as they work. So you can observe them on how well they understand in a group versus individually, observations, conversations, and products. So to capture that data so that we knew where they were in their learning, we adapted an instrument that they were using to self-assess, and we took a look at what Peter Liljedahl says in the book, and we created this. So it breaks down mild, medium, and spicy. It doesn't have any question numbers, but it breaks down that outcome by indicator. And then at the bottom, we took the legend from the book. So whether or not they could do it individually, if they needed help, if they attempted a question but made an error, if they made a silly mistake. And it's really time consuming. Like, there's no way you would be able to do this sort of table with every single student in your room. It wouldn't be reasonable. You have so much else to do. So what we did instead is we tried it with students who were close to meeting the outcomes, but who weren't quite there yet. And that was much more feasible. We then took this data to identify what supports are needed for any given student. So it could be used when planning with resource teachers or math support teachers. If my math support teacher came in my room and was, say, going to take a couple of students, I could hand him this sheet and say, this is the indicator the student needs to work on, and this is where they are. That way you know if they're making silly mistakes or if there's a deeper misconception somewhere that needs to be addressed. I also found it really helpful for when report cards came around, because I could go back and see exactly what that student was able to do and what areas needed improvement. We did it at the end of Unit 6, so it was towards the end of the year. I can see it being really helpful during conversations with parents, but I haven't had a chance to use it this way yet. And now that we have this template, it's super easy to just go in, change the outcome at the top, change the indicators on the side, and then use it for whatever you're working on. So I'm planning on trying it out again in September to see how it goes.
All right. Peter Liljedahl's research reveals that there are 4 practices that work together to achieve the transfer from group work to individual understanding. Consolidation, meaningful notes, check your understanding, and know where you are and where you're going. Consolidation is done as a group and provides students with the opportunity to make sense of what they have been collectively doing. Then they will have the first opportunity to extract that personal information when writing their notes, and to check their understanding when solving or completing check your understanding questions. The ongoing formative assessment helps students understand where they are and where they are going within the scope of the outcome and indicators and questions. Our presentation is getting to the end, but we would like to acknowledge first that our implementation of the discussed practices is ongoing, and we gradually tried one practice at a time. There is still a lot for us to learn and to adjust, but we hope that you find what we shared with you today helpful, useful, and practical.
So in addition to what is already linked in the presentation, so a lot of the templates that you saw are linked, so you should be able to get a copy of those in English and French. There's also some links here. So the Thinking Classrooms website has a lot of really great resources, as well as digital copies of the tasks that you might see in the book. So the Pythagorean theorem task in the book is really great, and I was able to grab a picture of that to use with my students. The tasks by Alicia Burdess are there. There's a main Facebook page. If you're not a member of it, I'd highly recommend it. It has a spreadsheet of non-curricular tasks and another one of curricular tasks. Now, you're going to want to sift through those a little bit, because I find a lot of the times they're not aligned to our outcomes here in Nova Scotia. So I have to go back to, say, grade 6 outcomes somewhere or grade 7 somewhere else to find what I'm looking for. Podcast by Peter Liljedahl, and the HRCE Teaching and Learning site has a lot of really great stuff there as well. So next slide. You might be thinking, where do I go from here? Like, where do I start? Because it's a little overwhelming. So a few suggestions. You might want to read or reread a chapter in the book. I know I'm going back to read the consolidation chapter before school starts again. Attend some PD on building thinking classrooms. Try out one or more of the 14 practices. You don't need to do it all at once. Actually, we'd recommend not doing everything at once. Just start. Peter Liljedahl breaks them into toolkits. Start with the first or second toolkit. Share a resource or a task that you have with some colleagues. Collaborate with other teachers or support staff at your school in your region, or get in touch with feedback on something that you tried. So this is towards the end of our presentation. I know Suad is going to bring up our contact information, as well as a link to this presentation, and there you can link all of these resources. But if you have any questions or feedback or anything, throw it in the chat there. So Suad has put a link to the presentation in the chat as well.
Can you still see your screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right. Any questions or feedback? We would appreciate it. Or otherwise, I think this is it for us, right, Deidre?
This is it, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.